Hey there guys, my name is Siobhan Fallon. Welcome back to Custer's 7th Cavalry. Today we're going to talk about Thomas Ward Custer, who was the first American soldier to receive the Medal of Honor twice. Like his more famous older brother, Tom Custer served in the Civil War all the way through to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. But there was lots of drama in between, a mix of myth and truth, including some scuffles with famous lawmen, with Lakota warriors, and love troubles. So let's learn more, guys. Thank you so much for joining me.
The Custers did not let their humble beginnings hold them back. Thomas Ward Custer was born on March 15, 1845 in New Rumley, Ohio. He was the third surviving son of Emanuel and Maria Custer. The eldest son was George Armstrong Custer, then Nevin, Tom, Boston, and then the daughter, the baby, Maggie or Margaret. There were 6 years between George and Tom, and that did not stop Tom from following George's footprints. Both men had extraordinary careers during the Civil War. Tom, who enlisted at 16, received the highest award from the United States Army, the Medal of Honor, when he captured enemy flags and enemy prisoners in 2 separate battles, Namazine Church and Sailor's Creek, both in the weeks prior to General Lee's surrender. Tom had been shot in the face when he seized the Confederate flag at Sailor's Creek, and he would bear that scar for the rest of his life. After the war, George Armstrong Custer received a commission as a lieutenant colonel of the newly formed 7th Cavalry at Fort Riley, Kansas. He managed to get Tom a commission and to have him transferred to the 7th as well. Tom joined his brother and George's young wife, Libbie, in Kansas in November 1866. That first year of the 7th Cavalry's history was rocky. They were the main fighting force of General Hancock's campaign to stop the deprivations committed by the Cheyenne and Lakota. But after 3 months in the field, the 7th was plagued by desertions and could find nothing but dead bodies. The campaign ended in failure, with General Hancock removed, General Sheridan put in his stead, and George Armstrong Custer arrested and court-martialed. And one of the main witnesses for the prosecution was Tom himself. George was found guilty and suspended for 1 year without pay. For more on the trials and tribulations of Tom's early life, and there were plenty, please see Tom Custer Fought Like a Lion. That's my video that focuses on his younger days. Now we'll pick up in 1868. After Custer's court-martial and suspension, Major Joel Elliott became the acting commander of the 7th Cavalry. Major Elliott commanded Tom to cut his hair, which Tom did not appreciate. Tom also began drinking more without his teetotaling brother George around, and he was struggling with his faith, or perhaps he thought a crisis of faith was a helpful method of flirtation. Albert Barnitz's wife Yenne wrote her husband a letter recounting how a young woman, a Miss Adams, helped Tom, quote, reform. General Alfred Sully, lieutenant colonel of the 3rd U.S. Infantry, was put in charge of the summer campaign of 1868 against the Indians. Tom had a favorite dog at this time named Witch, who had fought and killed a wolf. But the Kansas heat took its toll. Witch took ill on campaign, probably with heat stroke, and Tom carried her on his horse with him. He tried everything to get her to drink, but she didn't make it. The Custers loved their dogs. Author Brian Dugan has written an entire book about it, and I highly recommend it. As the summer dragged on, the Sully campaign proved even more ineffectual than a Hancock campaign of the previous summer. 7th Cavalry officer Edward Godfrey said of the Sully campaign, quote, "It had a demoralizing effect on the command." Major Joel Elliott wrote in a letter, quote, "I had the honor to command the cavalry on that expedition, and if it was fighting," and he underlined the word fighting twice, "then the Indian Wars must be a huge joke." General Sheridan decided that there was one man who might fix the situation, George Armstrong Custer. It didn't matter that Custer was still suspended. Sheridan wired Custer, who was home in Monroe, Michigan. Sheridan wrote in a telegram dated September 24, 1868, "General Sherman, Sully, and myself, and nearly all the officers of your regiment, have asked for you, and I hope the application will be successful. Can you come at once? 11 companies of your regiment will move about the 1st of October against the hostile Indians." Well, Custer, overjoyed, said yes. And he was back out on the plains within a week. He surprised his brother Tom at the regiment's camp 30 miles south of Fort Dodge. Said Sergeant John Ryan, "We were all very glad to see him back, as we thought he was the only man that was capable of taking charge of the regiment." Even Frederick Benteen, who many of you know was not a fan of George Custer, claimed he himself suggested that Custer should be returned to the 7th Cavalry before his punishment expired. So, whatever division there was in the 7th Cavalry surrounding Custer's earlier court-martial and the drama of, quote, choosing sides in what Edward Godfrey called the, quote, Custer business, Sully's rather dreadful leadership put a Band-Aid on the fissure, at least for the moment, and whatever the men had thought once of Custer's style of leadership, now they missed it. General Sheridan said to Custer upon his return that he could, quote, smoke a cigar in peace once more as Custer had never failed him. And, "Custer, I rely in everything upon you and shall send you on this expedition without giving you any orders, leaving you to act entirely upon your own judgment." George Custer at this time was 29 years old. After George Custer returned to the 7th Cavalry, his wife Libbie recounted 2 separate anecdotes when Tom ended up needing new uniforms. Once Tom was bathing with another officer in a stream when a group of Indians snuck up on them. He and the other man jumped naked onto their horses' backs and raced to the army camp, and fortunately escaped without losing anything other than their clothing. Another time, Tom's dog attacked a skunk. Tom tried to separate the animals, and he was the one who got sprayed. But Tom was never one to let the opportunity to play a prank pass him by, so he and Captain Lewis Hamilton, who was the youngest captain in the Army at the time, and also the grandson of founding father Alexander Hamilton, decided to go visiting the tents of their friends. They'd enter each full tent and start asking what the terrible smell was, until all the other officers realized the skunk scent was actually radiating from Tom. Then the 2 young men would burst out laughing and leave that tent and find another. Tom was only 23. Lewis Hamilton was 24 at this time. In mid-November at Camp Supply, Sully and George Armstrong Custer argued over who was actually in command of the winter campaign. General Sheridan ended that question by sending Sully to Fort Harker. Then he ordered Custer to proceed south in the direction of the Antelope Hills, thence toward the Washita River, the supposed winter seat of the hostile tribes, to destroy their villages and ponies, to kill or hang all warriors, and bring back all women and children. Okay, guys, this is a really awesome photograph. This actually belonged to Frederick Benteen, and it's currently at the Hargret Rare Book and Manuscript Library at the University of Georgia, and they have the Frederick W. Benteen collection there, so it's super cool. That's Benteen's handwriting. He wrote down the numbers that you see, and this is the officers of the 7th right before they left on the Washita campaign in November 1868. So let's see, number 10 is Joel Elliott. Number 18 is George Custer. Number 20 is Tom. And 26 is Lewis Hamilton. And here's another photo. It's the men repositioned a little bit. It's not much clearer, but now the Custers are at least looking at the camera. And Hamilton has disappeared. And then finally, this is a photo of Tom around the same time as the Washita campaign. It was 28-year-old Major Joel Elliott who found the trail of a war party that led to the village of Chief Black Kettle and his southern Cheyenne. On the early morning of November 27, 1868, the 7th Cavalry surrounded the sleeping village. Captain Lewis Hamilton and Lieutenant Tom Custer rode with George Custer. Hamilton commanded Companies A and C, with Tom Custer leading Company C. While on this charge, Hamilton was shot. He slowly came to a stop, sliding off his horse dead from a single shot to the chest. Tom Custer received a bullet wound to his right hand. Albert Barnitz was severely wounded. They didn't think he would live. And Major Joel Elliott and 17 men who had dashed off after retreating warriors never returned. The 7th took the village quickly, but the fighting continued for hours. After they captured the women and children as Sheridan ordered, they learned from the Cheyenne women there were other villages dotting the Washita River. The officers realized that the warriors they saw gathering in the distance were not Cheyenne who had escaped, but arriving warriors from other tribes. Custer decided to march toward these villages as if he was continuing his offensive. And when the warriors returned to protect their own camps, the 7th turned around and went back under the cover of night. The day after the 7th arrived at Camp Supply, they buried Hamilton, with General Sheridan, George Custer, and Tom Custer, and others as pallbearers. The Washita campaign was declared a victory, but like much of history, and this history in particular, it's clouded in controversy. Please see my Washita videos for more details. General Sheridan declared, "The Battle of the Washita is the most complete and successful of all our Indian battles." But the press coverage was mixed, some accusing the 7th of attacking a village of peaceful Indians. The Washita also revived the division within the 7th Cavalry, and the men would be talking about this fight and how Custer had abandoned Major Elliott right up to the Battle of the Little Bighorn nearly 8 years later. This Washita campaign actually stretched all the way until spring of 1869, with the 7th trying to convince the Southern Plains tribes to move onto their reservations. The 7th didn't return to Fort Hays until April. Housing was not finished, and so Custer created a village of white canvas for Libbie. She wrote, "The company carpenter built us such a comfortable little platform with a railing that we felt as if we had a real gallery to our canvas house, and sitting out there, Tom smoking, I sewing, General Custer reading, we imagined the big creek to be the Hudson. Our brother Tom, while he enjoyed our arbor, refused to call it anything but the beer garden." Libbie also described how valued Indian mementos were, from war shirts trimmed with, quote, "soft yellow child's hair presented by an Indian," to scalp locks, war bonnets, Indian shields, and bear claw necklaces. She likened these items to family diamonds. During their stay at the Big Creek camp, she wrote, "Colonel Tom's next most valuable possession was a box of rattlesnakes. He was an expert at capturing them. When he discovered a snake with 7 or more rattles, he leapt from his horse, called his orderly to take off his coat and tie up the sleeve and hold it for the prisoner. Then, with a well-aimed and violent stroke with the butt of his carbine, he pinioned the reptile near the head and held it down with one hand, seized it by the back of the neck, lifted it and dropped it into the sleeve and tied it up again. Tom kept these snakes in, quote, insecure cages of patched-up hardtack boxes, and the snakes had to be lifted out to exhibit them." Libbie would sit on Tom's bed while he pulled each snake out and stretched it before her, and no excuse would get her out of this viewing. She once suggested that Tom keep them all in one box, but he was on to her, and he responded, "If you think, old lady," and old lady was his nickname for Libbie, "if you think, old lady, that after all the trouble I have been to catch these snakes to show you, I'm going to make it easy for them to eat each other up, you are mightily mistaken." Libbie wasn't the only one who didn't appreciate Tom's choice of pets. Algernon Smith soon joined the camp and accepted Tom's offer to stay with him while he waited for his own quarters to be ready. But between Tom's pet wolf and the boxed-up snakes, Smith soon found a different place to bunk. This is an awesome photo taken circa 1869 during a buffalo hunt, and that's George Custer sort of down in the left in the grass reading, and that's Tom Custer toward the right, kind of leaning against Libbie Custer, who has a shawl around her head, and Tom's wearing the kepi, and you can see the dogs in the grass because there are always dogs. So in Christmas time, 1869, Libbie stayed at Fort Hays while George and Tom went on to Monroe, Michigan to spend the holiday with Emanuel and Maria Custer. George had an official function, and after the holiday, he continued to Washington, D.C. on Army business. But Tom was able to get 3 weeks furlough, which he extended for an additional 3 months of leave. That's a lot of time off. Could Tom have spent some of it visiting his brother Nevin and his wife Nevin's wife, Anne, in Tontageny, Ohio? We know Tom fashioned himself as a ladies' man. Libbie wrote, quote, "Colonel Tom used to pay visits of an unconscionable length to the ladies of the garrison, and no amount of teasing on his brother's part would induce him to shorten them. If in visiting with the young ladies in our parlor he overstayed the hour he was due at stables or drill, I learned our bugle calls and hovered around Colonel Tom, humming it in his ears. He would make a plunge for his hat and belt and tear out of the house, thus escaping reproof." Libbie, again, had said after the Civil War, quote, "Brother Tom had spent the summer skipping from flower to flower, tasting the sweets of all the rosebud garden of girls in our pretty town. I had already taken to myself a good deal of the mothering of this wild boy, and began to worry, as is the custom of mothers, over the advances of a venturesome woman who was no longer young and playing for high stakes. It was no small matter to me, as I knew Tom would live with us always, if he could manage to do so, and my prospective sister-in-law would be my nearest companion. Lad as he was, he escaped and preserved his heart in an unbroken condition during the summer." So though Libbie may have urged Tom to find a companionable wife, she wanted to perhaps approve the choice herself. But Libbie was not around during this particular leave, and it's possible there was a young woman from the farm next door to Nevin's who caught Tom's eye. In 1870, Rebecca Minard of Togatani was 19 years old to Tom's 25. The Minards would have known the Custer family. Custers had also lived in Togatani before they moved to Monroe, Michigan. And compared to the elder Custers, Emanuel and Maria, the Minards were perhaps the more well-off family. Nevin Custer remained in Togatani, and on that map there you can see his farm in yellow and how close it was to the Minard family's farms. So remember, George Custer had been pursuing the daughter of a prominent judge in Monroe, Michigan. And that's a picture of Judge Bacon with his teenage daughter, Libbie Bacon, there in the left. Now, the Bacons were a much higher social class. They were upper middle class compared to the Custer family. In part one, we talked about how Emanuel Custer had been a blacksmith. He did not do well there. And then he became a subsistence farmer. So Custers never had much. And Libbie's father knew it. She would not even let her write letters to George Custer until Custer became a brigadier general of volunteers in the Civil War. And I firmly believe George and Libbie genuinely loved each other. But both sexes needed to make an advantageous marriage. And Tom had joined the Army at the age of 16. He'd never been a good student. He did not like farming. He had no other trade to fall back on. Though his Medal of Honor fame and his rank as an officer may have been seen as a way to move up the social ladder like his brother George had. The Custer boys supported their parents back in Monroe. Officers were not making much money. In the 1870s, as a lieutenant colonel, George Armstrong Custer was making less than $2,500 a year. And as a first lieutenant, which was Tom's rank, he was making less than $1,500 a year. To quote Irishman Miles Keogh, who I've done a couple of videos about, in a letter he wrote to his brother in Ireland, "I'm too proud to marry and have my wife support herself. But if I had an economical wife, I might get by gloriously." And then Keogh wrote another letter to his brother that again talks about the economics of marriage. "I might often have married for money, but never gave it a moment's serious thought." Frankly, if he was writing about it in a letter, he was probably thinking about it. Okay, folks, this is a photo of Rebecca Minard, and she's probably in her mid-40s at the time. So when she would have known Tom Custer would have been, I don't know, 20, 30 years earlier. Rebecca bore a son out of wedlock, probably in 1870, 1871. Remember, terrible, tremendous stigma in bearing a child out of wedlock. And of course, the woman bore the brunt of it. But however difficult it was, Rebecca was not going to let her son be lost to history. She named the boy Thomas C. Custer. So if indeed the child was Tom's, why would he abandon the girl and his baby? We'll never know. There were no maternity tests at the time. And I don't know, bad behavior, Tom wasn't the only one. Algernon Smith, who was Tom's friend, and of course an officer in the 7th Cavalry, also left behind a young woman who had bore his child. When Smith was 17, a 15-year-old girl in his town named him as the father of her baby, and she successfully sued Smith for support of $1 a week. Libbie Custer never mentioned little Tommy Custer. Surely the Custer family would have heard about the boy, especially as their neighbor, Nevin, remained in Tagatani until 1871, and Tommy was probably born before Nevin moved to Monroe, Michigan to join the rest of the Custer family there. Tommy's birth certificate has not been located. We don't know exactly when he was born. His obituary says that he was born in the late 1860s, but Mark Miner, who's done extensive research on Tommy and Rebecca, thinks Tommy was born probably 1870, 1871. He found this federal consensus of 1880 that lists Tommy as living with his grandparents and being 9 years old. I recommend anyone interested in this check out Mark's incredible website at www.mynerd.com. There in the left corner, you'll see the link. It's just got a wealth of information about Tom Custer and the Minard family, and really fantastic details and research there. So there's no evidence that Tommy ever met his father or the elder Emanuel and Maria Custer, or really anyone from the Custer family, which is such a shame. Because I look at this photo of Tommy on the right, and I think he looks a lot like Thomas Ward Custer. A similar coloring, the shape of the eyes, and the face, I don't know. And I can't help wonder if the Custers also would have seen that resemblance. So please know I am not tech savvy at all, but here's Tom. And this is Tom during the Civil War. He's probably about 20 years old here. And here again is a zoomed and flipped picture of young Tommy Custer. And I am just going to superimpose the illegitimate Tommy, and all I do is I make the photo a little bit more transparent. I don't know how to do anything fancy, but I'm going to put a young Tommy over the face of Thomas Ward Custer. There. So I think that the lips are matched up perfectly, same nose, and the eye sort of lines up. Ears are similar. And let's try it again with a little bit older photos. That's Thomas Custer when he is obviously older and his face is thinned out a bit. And then here is Tommy Custer, and this is probably his wedding photo. So he's in his mid to late 20s. And then let's try lining them up again. Man, I get chills looking at that because the eyes are so similar, the noses are almost identical, the lips, and even the ears, again, when you see them one on top of the other. So Tommy Custer became a member of the Sons of the Union Veterans of the Civil War, and clearly in Tagatani then they thought that his father was a veteran of the Civil War. And here, this is really interesting. That's Tommy Custer's obituary, and you can see they very overtly state that he's the nephew of General Custer and that his father is Tom Custer. So, of of course, there's no evidence. Tommy died of typhoid fever a couple years after he was married. He never had any children of his own, and he's buried in an unmarked grave. So it's hard for us to literally dig up any solid evidence, but this is what we have, and it's pretty compelling to me that Thomas Custer was Tommy Custer's father. Meanwhile, in 1870, at the time of little Tommy Custer's birth, Tom Custer may have already fallen for another young woman. Mystery surrounds this relationship as well. Lucia Gregory Burgess was born in 1847 in Cooperstown, New York. Her father owned a grocery store in Jersey City. My friend, the Little Bighorn researcher and writer Annie Donofrio, found that Lucia is listed on the federal census as living in Kansas City, Missouri in 1870, with her uncle, who was a reverend, and his family. At some point, Lucia gave Tom a small book called The Words of Jesus, which Tom carried with him always. On the flyleaf, she had written her name and the date of June 20th, 1868. But on a separate page, inside the front cover, she wrote, "For Colonel T.W. Custer, 7th Cavalry, USA." So it's unclear exactly when she gave this book to Tom. Lucia was a fragile young woman suffering from consumption. In letters home to his niece, Tom would refer to her as Aunt Lulu, so she was known to the Custer family. Perhaps Tom didn't claim little Tommy because of the simple fact that he didn't love Rebecca, but loved Lucia. And as Lucia was seemingly religious, perhaps he was afraid that she would not forgive his indiscretion. Again, these are things we will never know. Tom's sowing his wild oats applies to more than women, which is perhaps why he's often connected in the telling of an incident concerning the famous lawman Wild Bill Hickok. There's a legend about Tom Custer going into Hays City, drinking too much, getting himself into trouble, and being arrested by the marshal there, a Wild Bill, and that George Custer often had to go use his influence to get his little brother out of the slammer. According to this legend, in July of 1870, things got really bad, and Tom Custer got drunk in a saloon, and then he decided to bring his horse inside and try to make it do a trick that Wild Bill was famous for, which was getting his horse to jump up on a billiards table. Well, Tom's horse wasn't going to play along, so supposedly Tom shot the horse dead in the saloon, and Wild Bill arrested him. When the soldiers of the 7th Cavalry heard of this, they decided to go into town and kill Hickok. So the soldiers jumped Hickok, wounded him, he shot the soldiers, ran for his life, and he hid out until the danger had passed. Well, this whole tale is rather fanciful. We all know Tom Custer was no angel. He liked women, he liked gambling, and he liked whiskey. There's a story about a fire, and there was a shopkeeper who was asking for help, and he offered a barrel of whiskey to Captain Thomas French, saying if he saved the store safe, he'd give him the booze. So Captain French ordered his soldiers into the fire. The soldiers saved the safe, and as promised, the shopkeeper delivered a barrel of whiskey to the 7th camp. Instead of sharing the whiskey with the soldiers, Captain French and Tom Custer drank the whole thing all by themselves. But how much trouble was Tom really in Hays City? Besides the fact that Libbie says in a memoir that, quote, Wild Bill and General Custer were fast friends, and she describes Wild Bill favorably for quite a few pages. She even mentions this particular brawl, but there's no mention of Tom having any connection to it whatsoever. Now, if Libbie's brother-in-law started this fight, I think she would have avoided the subject entirely. And Jeff Broome, in his wonderful book, Indian Raids and Massacres, does get to the bottom of the real story. He proves that Tom Custer had nothing to do with it. Broome points out that Tom didn't get inserted into the tale until 1933 in a biography about Wild Bill, and there were no footnotes or proof substantiating the story. Now, there are plenty of contemporary accounts, and there is a lot of truth to it. 2 7th Cavalry soldiers did jump Wild Bill and tried to kill him. And Wild Bill not only escaped, but while he was pinned down, he managed to shoot one of those soldiers dead. But there's never been any evidence that Tom Custer played a role in it whatsoever. Personally, I can't imagine any member of the cavalry especially one who carried his dehydrated dog on his horse with him and tried to give it water and whiskey to save its life. I can't imagine a soldier who depended on his horse for his life would be able to shoot it dead in a saloon just because the poor horse didn't do a bar trick. In 1871, the 7th Cavalry was sent south to help with the continued problems of Reconstruction. Tom was separated from George Armstrong Custer and Libbie, and his company, M Company, under Major Marcus Reno, who was new to the 7th Cavalry, was sent to South Carolina. Custer tried to convince Captain Frederick Benteen and his H Company to swap with Tom's company so Tom would remain closer to him and Libbie, but Benteen said no. Tom led some very daring raids against the Ku Klux Klan there. He arrested several members. One night, Tom had his men surround a house, and under the cover of darkness, they waited for members of the Klan's hierarchy to arrive. When the men walked up, Tom and others jumped them. One Ku Klux Klan member got away, but the man that Tom himself tackled did not, and he was taken prisoner. Tom would repeat this sort of clandestine arrest in the future. Tom went on leave from February 6th to May 1st, 1872. He went to Monroe, Michigan for the wedding of his youngest sibling, baby Maggie, to James Calhoun. The ceremony was held on March 7th, 1872, and Tom signed the marriage book as a witness. But he also managed to see Lucia in Jersey City. In a letter dated April 23rd, he wrote his niece, Emma Reed, and referred to Lucia as your Aunt Lulu. He also mentions how ill Lucia was and how, if she was well enough, she was planning on visiting Maggie. He describes he and Lucia singing duets at the piano together and how Lulu was afraid to ask Tom how long he'd be staying with her. But in another letter to Libbie, Tom seems less optimistic and he's lonelier in general, writing, I have not heard from Lulu for a week or 10 days. She don't seem to get much better. Write oftener to your devoted brother. Tom left South Carolina in late 1872. The 7th Cavalry had new duty stations out west. He was reunited with George and Libbie while they wintered in Memphis, and then the 7th Cavalry departed for the Dakota Territories in early April 1873. But winter was not finished with them. They took the railroad all the way to the last stop in Yankton in present-day South Dakota, and Custer looked around to start setting up a camp. Suddenly a blizzard rolled in. George Custer ordered the men and the few wives with them into town while he and Libbie sheltered in a shack. Soldiers got lost in the storm and some suffered from severe frostbite, and mules and horses froze to death. George Custer was struck down in the night with a debilitating illness. Libbie tended him. When morning came, she realized that their shack was totally walled in by snow. Nonetheless, a few hours later, she heard a knock on the door and found Tom Custer out front with food and supplies. But when the weather cleared, the 7th Cavalry with Maggie and Libbie and the other few wives continued on to 500-mile march to Fort Rice, and they arrived there in June 1873. But their time at Fort Rice was short. They learned the 7th would be setting out on a new campaign in about a week. The ladies were sent to Monroe, Michigan, and the men headed west. While preparing to leave, Tom Custer drew up his will. He left half of his estate to his mother Maria and the other half to Lucia Burgess. He made a note that if Lucia died before him, all of his estate would go to Maria. George Custer and Jimmy Calhoun were his witnesses. He did not leave anything to Rebecca Murnard or mention young Tommy Custer. The day after he wrote this will, the 7th Cavalry left on the Yellowstone campaign. There was quite a bit of gambling going on in the officers' camp during the Yellowstone campaign. Tom was on a winning streak, while his brother-in-law, James Calhoun, was not. Tom tried to convince Jimmy to stop playing, to think of Maggie, to no avail. Tom sent a chunk of his winnings back to Libbie to deposit for him, and he asked her to send some money to his mother, Maria. I go into more detail about the Yellowstone campaign in my Bloody Knife videos, so please check those out. But my biggest takeaway from the string of skirmishes that happened between the 7th Cavalry and the Lakota and Cheyenne during that campaign was that the 7th had more fight on their hands than is often mentioned. And George Custer is more aware of the tactics of his enemy than we usually give him credit for. On August 4th, Custer, with 2 companies as an advance party, including Tom, had dismounted, and they were taking a rest when they spotted a group of warriors ahead. Custer was alert to a potential ambush, and he proceeded cautiously with Tom and about 20 men on horseback. Then Custer, after telling Tom to keep an eye on a stretch of timber in case this was all a trap, rode out alone with 1 orderly to talk to the Lakota. As feared, hundreds of warriors streamed out of the timber. As Custer and his orderly came tearing back, Tom dismounted his men into a skirmish line and was able to fight off the onslaught. The detachment then took cover in the timber until reinforcements arrived. Unfortunately, while this was happening, the sutler, Augustus Valerian, and the veterinarian, Dr. John Hosinger, had been filling their canteens about 2 miles away when they were attacked and killed by a small group of Lakota warriors. Dr. Hosinger's gold watch was missing when his body was found, and the gold watch comes up later. On August 11th, there was another fight. Again, the 7th were outnumbered, but they fought aggressively and turned the tide of the fight and chased off the warriors. The newspaper correspondent with the 7th described how Tom, an incredible horseback rider, quote, led his men furiously, and that he flew over a ditch about 15 feet wide. The man after him missed it, and the horse and rider rolled into a gully. Supposedly, Crazy Horse, Chief Sitting Bull, and Gall were all at this fight. At some point, the Lakota started calling George Custer Long Hair, and they called Tom Custer Little Hair. The Cheyenne supposedly called Tom Buffalo Calf, compared to George Custer being called Strong Arm. It's really interesting that the enemy had enough familiarity with Tom and George that Tom had the diminutive or the little brother names. After more than 3 months on the Yellowstone campaign, the 7th Cavalry arrived at Fort Abraham Lincoln on September 21st, 1873. Tom sent one of George's antelope heads to his girlfriend, Lucia. The wives soon joined the men. Wrote Libbie, "Our brother Colonel Tom met us and drove us to our new home. In the dim light, I could see the great post of Fort Lincoln, where only a few months before we had left a barren plain. Our quarters were lighted, and as we approached, the regimental band played Home, Sweet Home, followed by the general's favorite, Gary Owen." Soon after they were all reunited at Lincoln, Custer's house burned down in February 1874. Libbie woke to the sounds of the inferno and got her visiting friend, Agnes Bates, out of the house. George tried to save their belongings. The Fort Lincoln sentry on duty fired a shot of alarm, and the garrison woke to the fire in their midst. Tom ran inside to try and help his brother salvage items, but in moments the entire house was in flames. This rocking chair remains and is one of the only things they were managed to save. The commander's house was rebuilt, with Custer adding some new design touches of his own, like the wraparound porch. Tom lived with George and Libbie for a while in a spare bedroom, but later he moved into his own bachelor quarters. So this photo is a little later. It's about 1875, I think, that it was taken, but it's just, I love it. It just shows such personality. Fort Abraham Lincoln would be the nexus of the Custer clan. George and Libbie Custer, of course, and also James and Maggie Calhoun were there. James Calhoun's sister, Lottie, married Captain Miles Moylan, and they also had close friends at hand, including George and Annie Yates. Their little brother Boston arrived and stayed on, and he wrote home, "Tom and I have lots of fun together, and he and I will come up to post every night together after sundown on the roll call." Libbie wrote fondly of their time together, with Maggie playing the piano and lots of singing and theatricals taking place. On Friday nights we all gathered together to dance or have private theatricals or games, and there were innumerable practical jokes. Fort Lincoln would be their home until they left on the expedition that ended at the Little Bighorn. It was around this time when a young woman, Katie Garrett, came to visit her sister Molly, who was married to Lieutenant Donald McIntosh. George and Tom Custer decided to school Katie on riding and shooting. She'd write, "Tom drove me like a galley slave during my riding and shooting lessons, because," explained Tom, "once we leave for the campaign, you won't have anyone to teach you." Soon they began taking me hunting, and one day when I shot a bird from a branch, Tom forgot his manners. He slapped me on the back, shouting, "Golly, what a shot!" The summer of 1874 meant another campaign, this time the Black Hills Expedition. The 7th set out on July 1st. On the last campaign, Jimmy Calhoun, Maggie's husband, had been the butt of Tom's jokes. Now Tom had his youngest brother Boston to tease, who was 3 years younger than Tom. Tom told Boston to soak a bunch of stones in water to make them into sponges, and Boston did. And he also teased Boston mercilessly about the slow speed of his mule, which Boston preferred to ride rather than a horse. But Boston was used to his brothers and didn't pay them any mind. There was lots of great hunting. They found fossils of a dinosaur. And of course, this was the expedition that found gold in the Black Hills. And the Black Hills, which had been set aside as land for the Lakota, was suddenly contested again. The 7th was gone for 60 days, and they managed over 800 miles. Libbie wrote of their return, "By and by, the long wagon train appeared. Many of the covers had elk horns strapped to them until they looked like strange bristling animals as they drew near. The men were just as wild-looking," she continued to write. "Some wives did not know their husbands. Many, like the general, had grown heavy beards. All were sunburned, their hair faded, and their clothes so patched that the original blue of the uniform was scarcely visible, and the boots were out at the toes." It was winter of 1874 that the famed scout Charlie Reynolds found himself at the Standing Rock Indian Agency listening to a Hunkpapa Sioux admit to having committed murder. Standing Rock was about 90 miles south of Fort Lincoln. And there was more mingling at these agencies and forts. The worlds of the Indians and the white man were not as separate as we think. Charlie Reynolds was attending a ceremonial dance when the warrior Rain in the Face got up and told of his attack and killing of a white man. And then he revealed a large gold pocket watch, which Reynolds recognized as having belonged to Dr. John Hunzinger, the civilian veterinarian killed during the Yellowstone campaign in August 1873. Charlie Reynolds returned to Fort Lincoln and told George Custer what he had learned, and Custer, with sealed orders and in utter secrecy so that no word could get back to Standing Rock, ordered Captain George Yates and Tom Custer with him on a mission to arrest Rain in the Face. On December 13, 1874, Tom, George Yates, and Charlie Reynolds rode into Standing Rock with 50 7th Cavalry troopers. They arrived on a day that the beef rations were being distributed and enacted a complicated plan so as not to arouse suspicion. They sent the 50 troopers out to the camp on the outskirts. And those men asked about a separate incident and acted like they were pursuing 3 Lakota who had killed civilians the previous year. Meanwhile, Tom Custer, with only 5 men, went into the trader's store and waited for Rain in the Face to come in. They knew that Rain in the Face, even though he vocally opposed any treaties, was still known to collect the provisions provided by those treaties with the United States government, and he especially came in the winter. Libbie wrote, "Colonel Tom had to wait for hours, only looking furtively when the sharp eyes of those wary creatures were off guard. At last he identified Rain in the Face. Coming suddenly from behind, he threw his arms around him and seized the Winchester rifle. Rain in the Face was taken completely by surprise. He drew himself up in an independent manner to show his brothers that he did not dread death. The soldiers tied his hands and mounted guard over him. About 30 Indians surrounded them instantly. The officers prevailed in the end, and the prisoner was taken to the cavalry camp. After the command had returned and the officers reported, General Custer sent for Rain in the Face. He was tall, straight, and young. Through an interpreter, General Custer spent hours trying to induce the Indian to acknowledge his crime. Finally, he gave a brief account of the murder. The next day he made a full confession before all of the officers. He said neither of the white men were armed when he attacked them. He had shot the old man, but he did not die. So he then went to him and with his stone mallet beat out the last breath left. The younger man signaled in the manner that was an overture of peace. When Rain in the Face reached him, the white man gave him his hat, but Rain in the Face shot him, first with a gun and then with arrows. Supposedly, Rain in the Face spoke freely to Custer, but whenever Tom entered the room, the Lakota scowled at him, and he told Tom he would kill him and eat out his heart. Rain in the Face was put in chains. His brother and a coalition of chiefs tried to exchange Rain in the Face for 2 other warriors, but Custer refused. Instead, he put the warrior in the guardhouse with a man who had been caught stealing from the fort. Rain in the Face would not be imprisoned for long. He and the man he was jailed with broke out one night a couple of months later. Rain in the Face was then sent an agency or peaceful Indian to Fort Lincoln with the news that he had joined Sitting Bull, and he still intended to get revenge for his imprisonment. In a later interview, Rain in the Face said, "I was treated as a woman, not as a chief. They put me in a room, chained me, gave me only a blanket. Once Little Hair let me out, and the long swords told me to run. I knew they wanted to shoot me in the back. I told Little Hair that I would get away sometime. I wasn't ready then. And when I did, I would cut his heart out and eat it. I was chained to a white man. One night, we got away." But Tom had more to worry about than threats. His girlfriend, Lucia Burgess, died on February 16, 1875, from tuberculosis. She was only 26 years old. She was buried in the family plot in Cooperstown, New York. There's no mention of Tom in her obituary, and Tom doesn't write about Lucia's death in letters. He also never changed his will to remove her from it. Had they broken up? If Lucia had been lingering on her deathbed, wouldn't they have been writing each other? If those letters ever show up, if any of you find out any information, please let me know. We do know that time was running out for Tom Custer as well. There's a note written in Tom's hand in the Words of Jesus book that Lucia had given him and that he kept with him always. These words feel especially meaningful thinking of Tom's fate. He wrote, "For strangers into life we come, and dying is but going home, going home. Lord, tarry not, but come."
Well, guys, I'm going to end there for today, but the final installment is coming soon. In the meantime, please continue doing all the wonderful things that you've been doing, clicking that notification bell, liking my videos, and best of all, watching other videos of mine. So if you have time, watch another one right now. Leave me a comment, suggestion, whatever you think. Check out the description box. I have a list of resources there, links, books, articles, all sorts of things. And thank you to my friends, especially Dale Cosman, for helping me with all of these videos, to Gary Stewart and Annie Donofrio for letting me use some really cool images and info here, and to Mark Miner for his fantastic website that I mentioned in the video and it's in the description box. Thank you guys. See you soon. Come back. Bye.